Your belly fat isn't a diet problem. It's a rules problem. And there is a very specific difference between those two things. A diet problem needs restriction. A rules problem needs something Japan has quietly run on for generations. 6 food rules so unremarkable they don't even sound like a diet, because they were never designed to be one. 6 rules. No calorie counting. No macros. No giving up rice, and no giving up the foods you actually like. But followed consistently, they explain why the average adult in Japan carries visibly less abdominal fat than the average adult almost anywhere else in the developed world, without a single one of them ever going on a diet in the way that word gets used here. Stay with me until rule number 6, because number 6 is the one that makes the other 5 permanent. Without it, you'll follow these for 10 days, hit a wall, and go back to eating exactly how you did before. With it, none of this ever feels like discipline again, it just becomes what you do. But first, rule number 3 is the one that's going to surprise you, because number 3 has nothing to do with what you eat, nothing to do with cutting anything out, and takes about 90 seconds before your first bite. 90 seconds, and it may do more for your waistline than anything you've ever eliminated from your diet. Let's begin. Most of us think about belly fat the wrong way. We treat it as a math problem, calories in, calories out, and when the number on the scale doesn't move, we assume the answer is to eat less of everything, all at once, for a few brutal weeks, then quietly return to normal once willpower runs out. The cycle never breaks the pattern, because the pattern was never the target. Japan doesn't approach food that way. In Japan, managing weight is not an event you schedule for January. It is a series of small, structural food rules applied at almost every single meal, so consistently that abdominal fat simply never gets the metabolic conditions it needs to accumulate in the first place. There is a concept behind this called Hara Hachi Bu, eating until you're roughly 80% full, every time, without exception. And there is a broader structural principle called Ichiju Sansai, 1 soup, 3 dishes, a plate template that has quietly prevented the exact blood sugar spikes that drive fat storage around the midsection, for centuries, without anyone in Japan ever calling it a diet at all. 6 rules. Each one almost insultingly ordinary. Each one the difference between a metabolism that stores fat around your middle and one that simply never gives it the chance. Let's go through every single one. Rule number 1. Rice is never eaten alone. You have probably heard that rice is bad for weight loss, that it's a simple carbohydrate best avoided if you're trying to lose belly fat. I want you to stay with me here, because that belief is not just wrong, it's backwards. Rice was never the problem. Eating it by itself was. Here is what's actually happening at the level of your bloodstream. White rice on its own has a high glycemic index, it converts to blood sugar quickly, causing a sharp insulin spike. Insulin is a storage hormone, and one of its primary jobs when it spikes hard is to shuttle excess glucose into fat cells, with visceral fat, the fat around your abdominal organs, being especially insulin responsive. Eat a large bowl of plain rice by itself, and you are handing your body a strong signal to store, not burn. Now here is what changes the entire equation. In the traditional Japanese meal structure, rice is never the main event. It's one component of several, alongside protein, alongside vegetables, alongside a soup, and that combination is not accidental. Fiber from vegetables and fat or protein eaten alongside a carbohydrate measurably blunt the speed at which it raises blood sugar. Research on meal sequencing and glycemic response has consistently found that pairing carbohydrates with fiber and protein, rather than eating them in isolation, significantly flattens the resulting insulin spike, sometimes by 30% or more, depending on the composition of the meal. This is the actual mechanism behind why a culture that eats rice at nearly every meal doesn't carry the abdominal fat you'd expect from a high-carb diet. It was never about eating less rice. It was about never eating it alone. There's a second layer to this rule that matters just as much: portion structure. In a traditional Japanese meal, the rice bowl is small, deliberately, structurally small, sized to be one part of the plate rather than the centerpiece of it. Compare that to a Western plate where a starch, whether it's rice, pasta, or bread, often occupies more than half the visual real estate of the meal, with protein and vegetables as an afterthought squeezed into the remaining space. Same ingredients, wildly different insulin outcome, purely because of composition and proportion. The shift: rice isn't the enemy of your waistline. Rice eaten alone, in a large portion, with nothing to slow its absorption, is. Pair it with protein and vegetables, keep the portion modest, and the exact same food that supposedly causes belly fat stops behaving that way entirely. That is rule number 1. Now, rule number 2 is where this gets interesting, because it's something almost every Western eating pattern gets completely backwards. Rule number 2. Soup or a broth-based dish comes before the rest of the meal, not alongside it. This sounds like a minor sequencing detail. It is not minor, because what you eat first in a meal changes how your body processes everything that follows it, and almost nobody in the West thinks about meals as having an order at all. Here is the mechanism. Starting a meal with a warm, broth-based, often vegetable and protein-rich soup, miso soup being the most common example, does two things simultaneously. First, the volume and water content begin activating stretch receptors in the stomach that signal fullness to the brain, before a single bite of the higher calorie components has been eaten. Second, research on meal sequencing, specifically studies looking at vegetables and liquids first eating orders, has found that this pattern measurably reduces the total blood sugar spike from the meal as a whole, compared to eating the same foods in reverse order or altogether. In practice, this means that by the time rice and protein are eaten, a portion of the appetite signal has already been satisfied by something genuinely low in calories. You are not restricting what comes next. You are simply arriving at it less ravenous, which changes how much of it you actually want. There's a compounding piece here too. Miso, the fermented soybean paste at the base of the most common version of this soup, contains live cultures that support gut microbiome diversity, and a growing body of research links gut microbiome composition directly to how efficiently the body regulates fat storage, particularly visceral fat. This isn't a supplement claim. It's a daily, unremarkable bowl of soup, quietly doing two separate jobs at once, filling you appropriately before the rest of the meal, and feeding a gut environment that's been linked to lower abdominal fat over time. The West does the opposite of this by default. Soup, when it appears at all in an American meal, is often served alongside the main dish, or skipped entirely in favor of going straight to the entree, meaning the first thing hitting your bloodstream is frequently the most calorie-dense part of the meal, at the exact moment your hunger and appetite are at their peak. The shift, the same total meal, reordered so a warm broth-based dish comes first, produces a smaller blood sugar spike and a stronger fullness signal by the time you reach the rest of the plate, without removing a single ingredient from the table. That is rule number 2. Now, rule number 3, the 90-second habit I told you about at the very beginning. Stay right here, because this one is going to sound too small to matter, and then you'll do it for a week and understand exactly why it's on this list. Rule number 3. A pause, roughly 90 seconds, between sitting down and the first bite. Not a formal ritual. Not something that requires candles or ceremony. In many traditional Japanese meals, there's a brief moment before eating begins, often marked by the phrase itadakamasu, a short acknowledgement before the first bite, rather than diving straight in the second the plate is set down. Slow down here, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking a 90-second pause before eating can't possibly affect how much fat you carry around your middle. Here's what it's actually doing, physiologically. The body's digestive system has what's called a cephalic phase response. The anticipation of eating triggers the release of digestive enzymes and prepares the gut for what's coming. Rushing straight from zero to eating, with no transition, means your digestive system is playing catch-up for the first several minutes of the meal, which is associated with less efficient digestion and a higher likelihood of eating past your body's actual needs before satiety signals catch up. There's a second mechanism at play, and it's the more important one for belly fat specifically. Eating while stressed, rushed, or still mentally engaged with whatever you were doing 30 seconds earlier keeps cortisol elevated during the meal. And cortisol doesn't just affect stress in the abstract, it has a well-documented, specific relationship with abdominal fat storage. Chronically elevated cortisol during and around meals is associated with the body preferentially storing fat viscerally, around the organs, rather than distributing it elsewhere. A rushed, stressed meal isn't just an unpleasant way to eat. It's a meal eaten under exactly the hormonal conditions most likely to route its calories toward your midsection specifically. 90 seconds of pause, putting your phone down, taking a breath, acknowledging the meal in front of you before the first bite, is a small, structural interruption of that stress-to-storage pathway. It costs nothing. It requires no ingredient. and it changes the hormonal environment your entire meal is digested in. The shift, the same meal, eaten after 90 seconds of calm instead of eaten mid-scroll or mid-stress, is processed by a body with meaningfully lower cortisol, and lower cortisol during a meal is directly tied to less of that meal being routed to visceral fat. That is rule number 3. And now rule number 4, and this one is going to challenge something you were taught to think of as a healthy habit. Rule number 4. Fermented food appears at nearly every meal, not as a garnish but as a component. Miso, natto, pickled vegetables, sukmono, these aren't occasional additions in a traditional Japanese diet. They're a near-daily structural piece of the plate, the way a side salad might be in an American meal, except with a completely different metabolic function. Here's why this matters specifically for belly fat. Fermented foods are a direct source of live probiotic cultures, and an increasing body of research over the past decade has connected gut microbiome diversity, the range and balance of bacterial species in your digestive system, to how the body regulates fat storage, inflammation, and even appetite hormones. Certain gut bacterial profiles have been associated in multiple studies with a higher propensity to store visceral fat specifically, while more diverse, fiber and fermented food-fed microbiomes are associated with the opposite. There's also a direct digestive mechanism at play. Fermentation partially breaks down food before you even eat it. The bacteria have already done some of the metabolic work, which places less strain on digestion and is associated with reduced bloating and lower systemic inflammation. Chronic low-grade inflammation, much like chronic elevated cortisol, has its own separate, well-documented relationship with abdominal fat storage. An inflamed gut environment is correlated with higher visceral fat retention, independent of total calorie intake. The American diet, by contrast, is structurally low in fermented foods by default. Pickles, when they appear, are usually cured in vinegar and sugar rather than fermented, and yogurt, often the single fermented food in a typical American diet, is frequently sweetened enough to offset much of its probiotic benefit with added sugar that drives the exact insulin response this whole list is trying to avoid. The shift, a small serving of fermented food at most meals, isn't a minor nutritional bonus. It's a daily input into a gut environment that research increasingly ties directly to how much fat your body chooses to store around your middle, a variable that has almost nothing to do with calories at all. That is rule number 4. Now, rule number 5 is the one most people associate with restriction, without realizing it's actually the opposite of restriction entirely. Rule number 5. Eating to roughly 80% full, and stopping there, every single time. This is Hara Hachi Bu, the principle referenced at the start of this video, and it deserves its own full explanation, because it is arguably the single most important rule on this list for belly fat specifically. Here is the mechanism. Stomach stretch receptors that signal fullness to the brain operate with a delay, roughly 15 to 20 minutes between the food is in your stomach and your brain has fully registered how much. Eating until you feel completely, comfortably full, the Western default, means you have, almost by definition, already eaten past the point your body actually needed, because that signal hadn't caught up yet. Stopping at roughly 80% closes that gap deliberately, eating slowly enough and stopping early enough that the delayed signal has time to arrive before you've overshot it. The compounding effect of this rule, applied at every single meal for years, is enormous, and this is the part almost nobody calculates. If a habitual eat until full pattern results in even 10 to 15% more food at each meal than the body actually needed, applied across 3 meals a day, every day, for a year, that is not a rounding error. That is a substantial, sustained caloric surplus, arriving in small enough increments at each individual meal that it never feels like overeating in the moment, which is exactly why it's so easy to maintain for years without noticing. There's a psychological layer that makes this rule sustainable in a way that calorie restriction typically isn't. Hara Hachi Bu isn't eat less. It's stop slightly before full, which still means eating a full, satisfying meal, just with a slightly earlier stopping point. This is the critical difference between this and Western dieting. Nothing is eliminated, no food group is off limits, and the meal still feels complete. The restriction that makes most diets fail, the feeling of active deprivation, simply isn't present here, because 80% full doesn't feel like hunger. It feels like a normal, satisfied meal, just one eaten a few bites earlier than habit would otherwise dictate. The shift, the difference between eating until full and eating to 80% full isn't a difference in whether you feel satisfied. It's a difference in whether your body received a caloric surplus it never needed, repeated at every meal, for years, without a single moment of it ever feeling like a diet. That is rule number 5. Now, rule number 6, the one I told you at the very start, makes all 5 of the others permanent. Stay here, because this is the most important thing in this entire video. Rule number 6. The plate is small, and the meal is served across several small dishes instead of one large one. This one is not about any single food at all. It's about the structural container your entire eating pattern happens inside of, and it's the reason the other 5 rules don't require willpower to maintain. Here is what I mean. In a traditional Japanese meal setting, food is served across several small, distinct dishes: a small bowl of rice, a small dish of protein, a small dish of vegetables, a small bowl of soup, rather than one large plate with everything piled together. This isn't a presentation choice. It fundamentally changes how much food looks like enough before you've eaten a single bite. Plate and portion research is remarkably consistent on this point. Humans use the visual fullness of a container as a primary cue for how much to serve themselves and how satisfied they'll feel once it's empty, largely independent of the actual gram count of food involved. A large Western dinner plate, piled with a single large portion, sets an entirely different visual baseline for normal than the same amount of food distributed across 5 smaller dishes, each one appropriately, visibly full at a fraction of the volume. Multiple studies on portion perception have found that the same quantity of food, served in smaller individual containers rather than one large one, is rated as more filling and more satisfying by the people eating it, the exact same calories, producing measurably higher reported satisfaction. This is why Rule 6 is positioned last, and why it's the one that makes the other 5 sustainable. Rules 1 through 5 all depend, to some degree, on not overeating at each meal, pairing rice with other foods, starting with soup, pausing before eating, including fermented components, stopping at 80%. Every one of those becomes dramatically easier when the meal is structurally, visually sized to make a moderate portion look and feel complete, rather than fighting against a plate that was built to hold, and visually normalize, far more food than any of those 5 rules would otherwise suggest eating. Without Rule 6, the other 5 require conscious effort at every meal, indefinitely, which is exactly the kind of ongoing willpower most diets eventually run out of. With Rule 6, the container itself is doing part of the work, the same reason a person doesn't have to consciously restrict themselves from filling a teacup like it's a soup bowl. The size of what's in front of you quietly recalibrates what enough looks like, and once that recalibration happens, the other 5 rules stop feeling like rules at all. They just become what a meal looks like. The shift: you don't need to fight your portions at every single meal for the rest of your life. You need a plate structure that makes the right portion look and feel like the obvious one, and once that's in place, the other 5 rules run almost on autopilot. That is rule number 6. Here is everything in one breath. Never eat rice alone, pair it with protein and vegetables every time. Start the meal with a warm, broth-based dish before anything else. Pause 90 seconds before your first bite, every single time. Include a small fermented component at nearly every meal. Stop eating at roughly 80% full, not until you feel completely done. And serve meals across several small dishes instead of one large plate. 6 rules. None of them require giving up rice. None of them require a supplement, a cleanse, or a single day of actual hunger. Every single one begins tomorrow morning, the next time you sit down to eat. Your belly fat isn't stubborn because your metabolism is broken. It's stubborn because nobody ever handed you these 6 rules, while every diet plan you've ever tried was busy telling you to eat less of everything, all at once, instead of restructuring how you eat any of it. Now you have them. So here's what I want from you before you close this video. Right now, tell me in the comments which one of these 6 rules your current meals are most missing. Is it number 1, are you eating rice on its own, without protein or vegetables alongside it? Is it number 3, do you eat standing up, mid-scroll, with 0 pause before the first bite? Is it number 6, is your dinner one large plate piled high, instead of several smaller dishes? Tell me the number, 1 through 6, in the comments right now, because naming it is the first step, and someone reading your comment might recognize their own plate in it and finally decide to change it starting tomorrow morning. If this changed how you think about food and belly fat, send it to the one person you know who's tried every diet except this one. They're 6 small rules away from a stomach that finally stops fighting them. I'll see you in the next one.